A black man offers his seat to a pregnant woman. Moments later, he's accused, detained, and nearly destroyed by a lie. This is the story of Marlon Quaid. They say Mississippi's heat can peel the paint off a porch swing. But it ain't the sun that burns most here. It's how folks still look at you, like you wandered too far into the wrong part of a story. I've seen it before and lived it. Thought we'd outgrown it. But on a Tuesday afternoon, in a train car filled with whispers and thin patience, a man named Marlon Quaid stood up to offer his seat. That did, offered kindness. And somehow, that kindness became a threat. She pointed. The crowd shifted. And just like that, the weight of history fell on his back. This isn't just about one man or one moment. It's about how fast truth gets buried when skin color writes the headline about how justice, real justice, doesn't come when you call, but only if you chase it down. Sit with me a while. You'll want to see how this ends. The train had barely left the station when it happened. A man stood up to offer his seat to a pregnant woman. Simple, polite, the kind of gesture your grandmother would have praised. But that moment, that one human moment, became the spark in a tinderbox most Americans pretend isn't still smoldering. His name was Marlon Quaid. He was black. She was white. And in the South, even now, that detail still changes everything. When she collapsed minutes later, pointing to him in confusion and fear, the story wrote itself, not with facts, but with assumptions soaked in a history we still haven't washed clean. A crowd of strangers, unsure of what they'd seen, but sure of what they believed, let silence do the accusing. There was no evidence, no witness, just a black man standing too close. And in Jackson, Mississippi, sometimes that's all it takes. The scene unfolded like something out of a courtroom drama. There was no judge, just the court of public opinion, and its jurors were everyone in that train car. Marlon was escorted off, not with shouts or brutality, but with a polite urgency that somehow felt more chilling. Like they weren't angry, just convinced. Like they weren't punishing him, just placing him back where they always thought he belonged. And that's what makes this story matter. Because it's not just about Marlon, it's about every man and woman who's ever had to smile a little harder, speak softer, stand a little farther away, just to be seen as safe. It's about the subtle violence of being watched, followed, doubted, erased. It's about the terrible quiet of people who say nothing, and the awful noise of those who speak too much, too soon. This is a story of America's unfinished business. It speaks to those who remember what it meant to be told, you can sit here, but not there. You can live here, but not cross that street. You can breathe, but don't breathe too loud. It speaks to every mother who has taught her son how to survive a traffic stop, and to every father who wonders if his child will be judged by their heart or skin. And yet, there is something else in the middle of it all. A phone, a recording, a flicker of truth, quiet but undeniable. A teenage girl, unsure of herself but sure of what she saw, presses record, and suddenly, the tide shifts. The story isn't over. The narrative isn't locked, and that's the most American part, the fight to retell what has already been written. Marlon didn't ask to be a symbol. He didn't volunteer to be a headline. He only wanted to do what was right. But sometimes, doing what's right means becoming what others fear. And sometimes, it means standing alone until someone else is brave enough to stand with you. So stay. Watch. Listen closely. Because buried beneath the noise of accusation and doubt, there's a heartbeat worth hearing. Not just Marlon's, but America's. Uneven, imperfect, but still fighting to be fair. That's the story you're about to witness. And trust me, once you see it, you'll never look at an empty seat the same way again. The doors slid open with a tired wheeze, the kind of sound old trains make when they've run the same tracks for too long, across the same towns that never quite changed. Marlon Quaid stepped into the third car from the front. It smelled like warm vinyl, sweat, and a faint trace of old perfume, familiar and strange. He nodded politely to no one in particular and moved down the aisle, careful not to brush against anyone's shoulder. He'd learned long ago that even accidental contact could be misread. It was rush hour in Jackson. The seats were mostly full. Most passengers looked up briefly before returning to their phones, newspapers, or the fixed gaze of pretending not to see. But Marlon felt how anyone who's lived in their skin long enough can feel it. The double take, the quiet readjustment of a purse strap, the sudden awareness of space. There was one seat left, technically. Near the middle of the car, between a middle-aged man with a thick beard and a woman scrolling through recipes on her phone. Marlon didn't take it. Instead, he stood, steadying himself with the overhead rail, and let his bag hang loosely over one shoulder. He wasn't tired enough to risk the conversation that seat might cost him. He stared ahead, not at anyone, just past them. Through the fogged-up window, he could see the blurred outline of the neighborhood he used to bike through as a child, before it became where people locked their car doors when they drove by. A girl across the aisle peeked at him from behind her mother's arm. Big brown eyes, curious. He gave her a faint smile. She quickly turned away, and her mother pulled her a little closer. That, too, was familiar. He adjusted his stance as the train lurched forward, the familiar rhythm of metal on track humming beneath his feet. That's when he noticed it. The eyes. Not many. Just a few. A sideways glance here. A stillness that wasn't quite natural there. It wasn't overt. No one said a word. But Marlon knew what it meant. They were watching him, not with fear exactly, but with a sense of preparation, as if bracing themselves in case they had to explain later that they saw something strange right before it happened. This wasn't new, but it was still bruised. He thought about his sister, Aubrey, when she asked, "Do you ever wish you could just disappear, even for 5 minutes?" He'd laughed it off then. But now, standing under that flickering light, in a car full of people pretending not to look while quietly calculating his every breath, he understood exactly what she meant. He exhaled slowly and shifted his grip on the rail. Then she stepped in. A woman, mid-30s, white, pregnant. Her dress clung to her like the humidity outside, and she looked like she was holding her entire body up with sheer will. She scanned the car, hoping, maybe praying, that someone would offer her a seat. Nobody moved. Not the man with the beard, not the woman with the recipe app, not even the ones who were watching her sway. It wasn't hostility. It was inertia, discomfort, the unspoken code of not my problem. Marlon didn't hesitate. He tapped her gently on the elbow. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low and respectful, "you can take mine." She looked surprised, even skeptical at first. Then her shoulders softened. "Thank you," she whispered. He stepped back, letting her pass. As she sat, a quiet, collective awareness shifted through the car. He'd done something decent. But more than a few people now had a reason to watch him a little closer. He returned to the overhead rail, standing again. The train moved forward, and with it, the story neither of them knew they had just begun. The woman's name was Imani Vance. She hadn't said it, but the car seemed to register her presence before speaking. The way people do when someone looks like they're about to fall, and no one wants to be responsible for catching them. Her steps were careful but uneven, one hand pressed against the curve of her belly, the other clutching the metal pole near the doorway. Her eyes darted from seat to seat, nothing available, no offers. Her skin was pale beneath the flush of the Mississippi heat, and her breathing came in shallow gasps. She looked like a woman whose body was on the edge of saying, "Enough." And still, no one moved. Not the man flipping through stock quotes. Not the teenage boy lost in his earbuds. Not the woman who had moved her purse onto the adjacent seat, as if reserving it for a ghost. They saw her. But seeing wasn't the same as acting. There's a certain paralysis that comes over people when kindness means confronting their comfort. Until Marlon stood. It wasn't dramatic. He didn't make a speech. He didn't glance around to shame the others. He just moved, a quiet motion with weight. "Ma'am," he said, voice even, eyes lowered slightly in the way Southern men sometimes do to show respect without surrender. "Take my seat, please." Imani blinked, startled. She was not used to being spoken to gently by strangers, especially not lately. Her eyes flitted briefly around the car. No one else even looked up. She hesitated. Whether out of politeness or suspicion, it wasn't clear, then gave him a tired nod. "Thank you," she said, the words catching slightly in her throat. She eased herself into the seat with care, both hands guiding her belly as she lowered herself into it. The sigh that escaped her lips was part relief, part exhaustion. Her body settled, but something in the air remained tight, as if the gesture had interrupted a balance no one wanted to admit existed. Marlon took a spot near the end of the car, gripping the same rail she had clutched moments earlier. His back was to the doors now, his eyes scanning nothing. A man across from him watched, not with malice, but with that quiet, suburban suspicion that says, "I've seen stories like this before, and they don't end well." Imani adjusted the strap of her bag and leaned back into the seat. She closed her eyes, just for a moment. Her face was slick with sweat, the kind that clings to someone not from the South, or perhaps someone with too much on her mind. She shifted again, one hand pressing lightly against her side. Marlon noticed, but said nothing. He'd done his part. At least, that's what he thought. The train rattled around a bend. The car jolted. Imani's body lurched slightly, then stilled. She let out a soft groan, barely audible. A woman 2 seats over glanced at her, then away. Marlon furrowed his brow. He didn't move, not yet. Then came the sound. Not a cry, not a shout, just the dull thud of a bag hitting the floor, followed by the sight of Imani slowly folding in on herself. Her body curled like paper in the rain. Her arms clutched her stomach. Her mouth opened, but produced only air, and her eyes, vast, wild, scanned the car as if searching for something she couldn't name. Marlon stepped forward instantly. "Ma'am?" he said, crouching beside her. "Are you okay?" She gasped. Passengers looked up, screens dimmed, conversations died, and Imani's eyes locked on Marlon's face in that fragile hush. "It was him," she whispered. He did something." The car froze. Marlon's hand hovered midair, still outstretched. Someone whispered, "Did you see that?" Another voice said, "What did he do?" No one knew, but everyone was starting to believe they did. The sound, more than anything, the soft, sickening thud of Imani Vance's bag hitting the floor, followed by her body folding in slow collapse, broke the rhythm of the ride. A second earlier, everything was in motion. The steady clatter of the train on its tracks, the hiss of the air conditioner, the shuffling of shoes and paper bags. Now, the air had gone still. Even the train seemed to slow, unsure whether it should keep going. Imani had slumped forward, her head hanging, her hands gripping the sides of the seat as though her body no longer belonged to her. One knee hit the floor with a dull knock. Her breath came in short, panicked bursts. Her mouth opened. No words. Just the raw instinct to survive. Marlon Quaid was the first to move. He had been watching from across the car, sensing something was off since she sat down. Not for attention, not out of guilt, but because his life had taught him this. Always read the room. Always see what others don't say. And right now, Imani was silent and screaming. He stepped forward and crouched beside her. His hand reached out, hesitant, open, palm up. "Ma'am?" he asked, gently, almost whispering. "Are you all right?" Her eyes shot open. The contact didn't happen. He hadn't touched her. but their faces were now inches apart. Her gaze was sharp, unfocused, panicked. She looked right at him, through him, and then came the words. It was him. Marlon's heart stuttered. The sentence wasn't shouted. It wasn't even loud. But it rang out like a gavel, clear, accusatory, and loud enough to make heads snap toward them. He did something, she gasped, pressing a hand to her belly as if trying to shield it from whatever memory her mind had just written. Marlon's hand froze mid-air. What? He said, blinking, not in anger, but in disbelief. No, A woman across the aisle stood halfway up. She said you did something. The older man in the corner set down his newspaper and narrowed his eyes. I saw him get up earlier. Didn't know why he stood. I just gave her my seat, Marlon said, slowly rising to his feet, his hands lifted slightly, instinctively, palms visible, as if that could defend him against something worse than a misunderstanding. The murmurs began, soft at first. You saw how close he was. She looked fine till he moved near her. He bent over her just now. Did he touch her? No one said the word, but it hung in the air like humidity. Threat. He was the threat. Marlon looked around the car. Faces had turned. Not all hostile, not yet, but something had shifted. A room that had ignored him minutes ago now seemed full of eyes. Please, he said, trying to keep his voice even. I didn't do anything. I gave her my seat. That's it. A teenager reached for her phone, and a man in a business shirt pulled out earbuds. Someone had already pressed the emergency call button. The train hadn't stopped moving, but inside that car, time fractured. The moment had calcified. They no longer saw his gesture. They didn't know the man who stood up when no one else did. All they saw was the shape of him, standing over a white woman who looked afraid and fragile. No one reached for Marlon. Not yet, but he could feel it coming. He wasn't in a train car anymore. He was on trial, and the only evidence presented so far was the color of his skin. The train didn't stop right away, but everyone inside it had. Conversation froze. Movement stalled. The moment Imani Vance uttered the words, "It was him," the car turned from a space of passengers into a tribunal. She didn't scream. She didn't accuse with force. That was what made it worse. Her voice cracked like porcelain under stress, fragile but cutting, full of suggestion without explanation. She clutched her belly as though pain were truth. Her eyes welled. She pointed, softly, shakily but unmistakably, at Marlon Quaid. And that, somehow, was enough. He stood there, tall, dark-skinned, quiet, confused. The picture had already been painted. She didn't need to say anything else. Marlon's hands were still raised, his chest open, like a man taught to diffuse situations that shouldn't exist. His voice was calm and deliberate. Ma'am, I didn't touch you. I gave you my seat. His eyes begged her to remember, to clarify, to say the words differently. But Imani looked lost, and the fear in her face no longer belonged to reason. A man in a gray blazer stood from his seat, subtly between Marlon and the woman. Sir, maybe you should back up, the man said. I wasn't close, Marlon replied, shaking his head. I was over there. I saw her stumble, and I came to check. She said you did something, another voice interrupted. A woman clutched her purse tighter, her lips pursed as if she regretted not stepping in earlier. She's pregnant. You don't just fake that kind of reaction, a man mumbled. Marlon felt his throat go dry. This wasn't the first time he'd seen a room flip, but it had never happened this fast. He tried to anchor himself in the facts. He had stood, offered his seat, and thanked her. She had sat. Minutes passed. Then she collapsed. That was it. But the facts were weightless now. Something heavier had taken their place. Memory, myth, fear. All of it is as American as the tracks beneath this train. A young woman near the far end of the car lowered her phone. She had recorded something. He could tell. She didn't speak. Not yet. Her eyes darted between Marlin and the others. She looked afraid of being wrong in public. And the silence around her gave space to those who weren't afraid. "Somebody call the conductor," an older man muttered. "We need someone to stop the train." A woman leaned toward another, whispering, "He was standing near her bag. Maybe he took something." "I think he tried to touch her," another voice said. "I didn't see it, but the way she looked." Marlin took a step back. "I didn't do anything," he said again, voice steadier now, trying to sound like a man, not a suspect. "Please, someone here had to see. I wasn't even near her seat after I gave it up. I stood at the back." But the story had already spread, not as a retelling, but a rewriting. People didn't remember what they saw. They remembered what they feared. And fear, in this car, had a color. Outside, the city rolled by. Oak trees, corner stores, a church with a broken sign. Inside, time felt stretched. The train slowed. Red lights blinked near the emergency door. A voice crackled through the speakers. "This is the conductor. We've received a passenger alert. Please remain seated. Security will board at the next stop." Marlin turned toward the window, but there was nothing to see. He wasn't in Jackson anymore. He was in that old, nameless space where stories like his always seem to start, where a gesture becomes a threat, and a black man standing quietly becomes something else entirely. No one in the train car said it outright. They didn't have to. The looks, the posture, the silence. It spoke volumes. Like dust settling after a storm, the passengers had already chosen sides. Or rather, they'd chosen safety. And safety, in this moment, meant believing the woman and doubting the man who had stood up first. Marlin Quaid felt it press in on him, not just the stares, but something heavier, expectation. He was expected to shrink, step aside, and not make this worse. He was supposed to accept suspicion as a condition of his presence. He stayed upright. "I don't understand," he said quietly, more to the room than to Amani. "I did what none of you did. I gave her the seat. And now, this?" There was a pause. And then, slowly, it began. The quiet translation of his words into something else. A woman 2 rows down crossed her arms. "That's a defensive tone," she muttered, loud enough for a man beside her to nod. "Exactly. Guilty people always talk about what they did right," he replied, voice low but certain. From the front of the car, the woman watching recipes leaned toward her husband. Why didn't he just stay where he was? Why move toward her if he didn't do anything? "He was hovering," another added. "I saw it. Looked like he was trying to whisper something." Someone else, eyes narrowed, whispered, "He reached for her bag, too. I swear." Marlin turned slowly, scanning the faces. Some looked away. Others didn't bother to hide what they felt. Discomfort, suspicion, quiet judgment. One man in a postal worker's jacket said plainly, "Man like him probably has a record already." A teen girl in headphones glanced up briefly, caught his eye, and then dropped her gaze as if it burned her. She looked like she wanted to say something, but didn't. No one was yelling. No one was panicking. That made it worse. The danger wasn't in a riot. It was in a room full of polite, confident people convinced by a lie they hadn't seen, but felt. It was the calm, lethal thing America had always been best at, painting guilt with civility. Marlin took another breath, carefully. He turned toward Amani, who still sat hunched, breathing heavily, eyes watery but unmoving. She wasn't speaking now, not again. Her hand remained on her stomach like a shield. But she didn't correct them either. She didn't say, "No, that's not what I meant." She let the assumption take root. And that, more than anything, told Marlon this story was no longer his to control. Someone at the rear tapped the emergency call box again, even though it had already been acknowledged. A quiet paranoia swept through the cabin. Doors would open soon. Authority would arrive. And everyone in that train car decided how to tell the story later. Who they stood near. What they thought they saw. Why do they feel afraid? Not because of a weapon, not because of a threat, but because of how Marlon looked when he offered his seat. A woman whispered, "You could tell something was off about him the second he walked on." Another voice added, "He looked too calm." Marlon didn't shout. He didn't beg. He stepped back and slowly placed both hands behind his head, not because anyone told him to, but because he knew how this worked. Better than any of them. He looked at the small security camera in the corner of the train, blinking, watching, and for the first time in several minutes, he allowed himself one small thought. Please, God, let it be recorded. The train screeched into the station with a metal howl that echoed down the tiled platform. It was the sound that usually meant nothing, just another stop and pause in the daily rhythm. But inside Car 3, it landed like a verdict. People straightened. The tension didn't rise. It solidified as if everyone knew what was coming but didn't want to be the one to say it first. The doors hissed open. 2 uniformed transit police officers stepped inside. Not rushed, not aggressive. Calm, controlled, certain. One was a white man in his 50s wearing a silver badge and looking tired. The other was Latino, younger, and more alert. When trained to measure risk by posture and skin, they scanned the car the way men scan rooms. And in seconds, their eyes landed on Marlon Quaid. He stood with his hands clasped behind his head, body open, unmoving. That gesture alone, silent, practiced, almost ritual, told the officers all they needed to know. Not about guilt, but about who in this room had been here before. The older officer spoke first. "We got a report of a disturbance involving a female passenger. Can someone tell us what happened?" They didn't have to ask twice. Voices rose, not loud but quick, layered over one another. A woman said, "She fainted." A man chimed in, "That guy was standing over her." Another added, "She said he did something to her." "She pointed at him," someone else said. "She looked terrified." "She's pregnant," another voice reminded. The officers nodded through the accounts, never rushing, never flinching. Their focus returned to Marlon. "You, sir," the younger one said. "Step outside the train for a moment, please." Marlon blinked once. "I didn't touch her," he said. Calm. Clear. "I gave her my seat. She collapsed. That's all." The older officer's voice remained neutral. "We're not making assumptions, sir. We just need to speak with you separately." From the bench, Imani Vance stirred. She looked pale and dazed. Her lips parted as if to say something, but whatever she meant to speak slipped back down her throat. Her eyes met Marlon's for a fleeting second, then turned away. Marlon looked at her. He didn't expect help. Not anymore. He turned to the officers, nodded, and walked forward, slow, careful, aware of every gaze that tracked his steps. The crowd parted for him like fog. No one touched him, but no one stopped him either. As he stepped off the train and onto the platform, the doors slid closed behind him. Inside, voices resumed. Quiet, hushed, now laced with a kind of self-congratulation. They'd done the right thing. They'd been vigilant. They'd reacted. No one asked if she might have been mistaken. No one wondered whether trauma and stress had made her misread a moment. No one considered that fear, particularly racialized fear, could be wrong. Because it felt right. In America, feelings are often louder than facts. On the platform, Marlin stood between the officers under the dull fluorescence, answering questions. One asked for ID and one jotted notes. Neither raised their voice, nor did they draw a weapon. It was all professional. However, professionalism can be just as cold as violence when it lacks humanity beneath it. Behind them, the train pulled away. Marlin didn't watch it go. His shoulders were squared, his chin lifted, not in pride, but in resignation. Because somewhere deep in his bones, Marlin knew this wouldn't end at the station. The precinct lobby smelled like old coffee and plastic chairs. Everything in the room was beige, walls, light, even the mood. Marlin Quaid sat beneath a humming fluorescent panel that flickered every 23 seconds. He had counted. Not because he was bored, but because he refused to count the minutes they made him wait. The chair was hard and cold. It did not have handcuffs or a cell, but it was just enough discomfort to remind him he was there not as a guest or a man, but as a maybe. They hadn't booked him. They hadn't charged him. But they'd taken his ID, phone, belt, and fingerprints for the record. He hadn't resisted. He hadn't even protested. He knew better. He'd been here before. Not this station, not this exact circumstance, but this feeling, this slow erosion of humanity wrapped in polite procedure, where the words weren't cruel, but the silence between them was. An officer passed the desk, not the one who brought him in. This one was younger. Blonde, clean uniform. She glanced at Marlin as she typed something on the monitor. Her face didn't move, but her eyes did. They looked at him not as a threat, but as a probability. Another one. Something minor. But still, it's one to keep an eye on. Marlin looked at his hands. Clean nails, calloused from honest work. He thought of the wrench he'd held that morning, fixing the brakes on a woman's Buick. The same hands that had passed a seat to a stranger now rested in his lap, waiting to be judged without context. A door opened. The older transit officer stepped in, holding a clipboard and a sigh. "Mr. Quaid," he said. "We're reviewing surveillance footage now. Shouldn't take much longer." Marlin looked up. "Can I ask something?" The officer nodded. "If she pointed at a white man," Marlin asked, "would he be sitting here right now?" A beat. No answer. Then the officer looked down, muttered, "That's not what this is about." Marlin gave a small smile. Tight, tired, knowing. "Sir," the officer continued, "we're just following up on a serious allegation. You understand." "I understand what it looks like when someone's afraid of me before I say a word," Marlin said. "I've understood that since I was 12. The officer shifted uncomfortably. "We'll let you know soon." Then he disappeared through another door, leaving Marlin with the hum, the flickering light, and the ache of being unseen. On the far wall, a framed poster read, "Equal protection under the law." Beneath it, the American flag drooped from a plastic pole. Marlin stared at it, not in anger, not even in disappointment, just in quiet inventory. How many rooms had he been in where that phrase didn't mean what it said? How often would he be asked to be patient while others were allowed to be loud, scared, reckless, and still believed? He thought of Aubrey, his sister, and the birthday cake, which was probably melting on the counter by now. He thought of his father, who said, "Being a good man won't always be enough, but you better be one anyway." A door clicked. Another officer leaned in. "They're almost done." Marlin nodded. He didn't stand. He didn't speak. He just sat in the cold chair, breathing slowly, because the only thing louder than a false accusation is the silence after no one defends you. The monitor was small, wedged in the corner of the back office like an afterthought. A worn desk fan hummed below it, blowing warm air in circles. 3 officers gathered around the desk, 2 in uniform, one in a rumpled shirt with sleeves rolled to his elbows. He looked like he had been doing this long enough to grow tired of it, but not long enough to stop. The footage played with no sound. On the screen, a grainy, wide-angle view of train car 3 is displayed. Marlon Quaid entered. He stood near the door, not bothering the other passengers. He didn't speak to anyone, didn't look at anyone for too long. He just stood, hands on the rail, shoulders low, body still. The officers watched in silence. Next frame. Imani Vance steps in. The pregnant woman struggles with her bag. She sways, visibly weary. No passenger moves, not even a flinch from the man sitting next to the only open seat. Then Marlon steps forward. The room stilled again, watching. He gestures, offers his seat. Imani looks hesitant, then accepts. The camera catches her lips moving. Thank you, probably. He returns to the rail. They ride. 3 minutes pass. Then, suddenly, she shifts. Her hand goes to her side. Her head drops. The bag slips. And Marlon moves toward her, not aggressively, cautiously. No contact. And then, the moment. The woman recoils slightly, eyes wide, mouth moving again. The room watches as she says the words. The officer, in rolled-up sleeves, pauses the video. She never touched him. He never touched her, he mutters. The younger officer scratches his chin. Then why'd she say what she said? The older one, who brought Marlon in, stares at the screen. He doesn't speak for a long moment. Then, because she was scared, and maybe scared of the wrong thing. No one responded. The footage rolled again. Marlon is backing away, hands lifted. The train car was turning against him. You could almost feel the fear building through the screen, not because of what had happened, but because of what people thought had happened. Perception had been louder than evidence. The older officer leaned back in his chair. He told the truth. Yep. Damn. Down the hall, Marlon still sat in the cold chair. He was motionless, but alert. He'd seen the clock hands move. They'd been gone 37 minutes. The younger officer came out first. His steps were slow and measured, like those of a man approaching a stranger in his backyard. Mr. Quaid. Marlon looked up, unreadable. We reviewed the footage, the officer said. You're free to go. A beat of silence. That's it? Marlon asked, voice low. You didn't do anything. You acted appropriately. She must have been confused. Her blood pressure was low. The medics think... I'm not interested in her blood pressure, Marlon said. I'm interested in how many people were ready to put me in handcuffs before you watched the tape. The officer looked at his feet. I understand. No, you don't. But I appreciate you saying it like you mean it. The room hung there, heavy. Then Marlon stood, slowly, carefully. Even now, still mindful of how he moved. The officer handed him his wallet, phone, and keys in a small plastic tray, like evidence being returned, not belongings. As Marlon walked past him, the officer said, Mr. Quaid, for what it's worth, you handled this with much more grace than most. Marlon turned back. That's because I've been taught to survive. Not to win. Just survive. And with that, he left. The camera in the corner blinked, and the truth, for once, had been caught. But the damage? It had already walked off the train, long before the tape played. The precinct doors clicked shut behind Marlon Quaid with the kind of finality meant for endings. But for him, it wasn't over. It never ended. Not when the world had already written the version of the story it wanted to believe. The night air hit his face like a wall. It was thick with Mississippi heat and the bitter scent of concrete that's absorbed too many storms. He blinked under the yellow parking lot lights, adjusted the strap on his bag, and checked his phone. He doesn't speak for a long moment. Then, because she was scared. And maybe scared of the wrong thing. No one responded. The footage rolled again. Marlon is backing away, hands lifted. The train car was turning against him. You could almost feel the fear building through the screen, not because of what had happened, but because of what people thought had happened. Perception had been louder than evidence. The older officer leaned back in his chair. He told the truth. Yep. Damn. Down the hall, Marlon still sat in the cold chair. He was motionless, but alert. He'd seen the clock hands move. They'd been gone 37 minutes. The younger officer came out first. His steps were slow and measured, like those of a man approaching a stranger in his backyard. Mr. Quaid. Marlon looked up, unreadable. We reviewed the footage, the officer said. You're free to go. A beat of silence. That's it? Marlon asked, voice low. You didn't do anything. You acted appropriately. She must have been confused. Her blood pressure was low. The medics think... I'm not interested in her blood pressure, Marlon said. I'm interested in how many people were ready to put me in handcuffs before you watched the tape. The officer looked at his feet. I understand. No, you don't, but I appreciate you saying it like you mean it. The room hung there, heavy. Then Marlon stood, slowly, carefully, even now, still mindful of how he moved. The officer handed him his wallet, phone, and keys in a small plastic tray, like evidence being returned, not belongings. As Marlon walked past him, the officer said, Mr. Quaid, for what it's worth, you handled this with much more grace than most. Marlon turned back. That's because I've been taught to survive. Not to win, just survive. And with that, he left. The camera in the corner blinked, and the truth, for once, had been caught. But the damage? It had already walked off the train, long before the tape played. The precinct doors clicked shut behind Marlon Quaid with the kind of finality meant for endings. But for him, it wasn't over. It never ended. Not when the world had already written the version of the story it wanted to believe. The night air hit his face like a wall. It was thick with Mississippi heat and the bitter scent of concrete that's absorbed too many storms. He blinked under the yellow parking lot lights, adjusted the strap on his bag, and checked his phone. He arrived at Aubrey's house just after 10. The porch light was on. Laughter spilled faintly from inside. He stood at the base of the steps for a moment, listening. The sound was warm, alive, unaware. He could go inside, smile, hug, and slice cake. And maybe he would. But part of him was still sitting in that train car, the part that had reached out a hand and watched the world recoil. He climbed the steps, one at a time, and knocked twice. The door opened. Aubrey stood there in slippers, brows raised, eyes searching his face. You good? She asked softly. Marlon nodded once. I will be. And for the first time in hours, he meant it. But deep down, he knew, for every man like him who made it home, there were others whose stories ended when the doors opened. The kitchen smelled like vanilla frosting and fried chicken. Home. The birthday banner above the cabinets drooped slightly, as if it too had waited longer than expected. A cluster of paper plates sat on the counter, half filled with melting ice cream, cupcake crumbs, and laughter that had long moved into the living room. Marlon stepped in, and the room didn't go silent, but it noticed. Aubrey's friends offered tight smiles, some genuine, others uncertain. One man clapped his shoulder, saying, "Good to see you, brother," without asking why it had taken so long. A little girl with frosting on her face handed him a deflated balloon. You missed the candles, Aubrey said softly, stepping beside him. Her voice was light, but her eyes scanned his like a sister who didn't believe in easy answers. "I was caught up," he replied. She nodded slowly. "I figured. You don't need to explain. Sit. Eat." He sat. The plate she brought him was warm, overfilled, comfort in edible form. But Marlon didn't touch it. Around him, conversation swelled again, gentle and distant. But even as the house moved on, he sat still, hands folded in his lap, eyes fixed on the flickering candle that hadn't been blown out with the rest. Someone had saved one for him. He didn't mention the police, didn't mention Imani Vance, didn't mention how a room full of strangers had looked at him and silently agreed, "That's the one." Instead, he took the fork. He picked at the food, slow and quiet. Aubrey joined him, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder, not pulling, not pushing, just there, present. And in that small silence between siblings, Marlon found something the station hadn't offered. Not justice, no clarity, but dignity. Reclaimed, if only for a moment. Outside, the crickets started singing. Inside, the cake was cut again, just for him. A new slice. A second chance. And though the taste didn't change what had happened, it reminded him why he had come home in the first place. Because even when the world sees you as a threat, someone still saves you a seat at the table. Later that night, when the laughter had faded and the dishes sat soaking in the sink, Marlon stood alone on the back porch, the screen door creaking slightly behind him. The Mississippi night wrapped around him like a heavy coat, humid, dense, and thick with the stillness that holds memory too well. He lit a match, not for a cigarette, but just to watch it burn. One flicker of control, 1 second of something obeying his hand. He didn't move much, just leaned against the porch post, his fingers tracing the ridges in the wood. The day's events pressed in, layer by layer, not as a sharp shock, but as a slow flood. And through it all, one name rose again and again, Imani Vance. She hadn't screamed. She hadn't pointed wildly. But she had said enough to end him nearly. And then she sat there, saying nothing, as the train silently condemned him. Was it confusion? Was it fear? Or had she known exactly what would happen the moment she spoke? He wanted to let it go, to chalk it up to a misunderstanding, misjudgment. But something in her eyes, wide, sharp, almost rehearsed, wouldn't let him. She had been afraid, yes, but not just of him, of something deeper, and she made him the vessel for it. Inside the house, someone switched off the living room light. A distant murmur of music slowed to silence. Marlon stayed outside. He took out his phone, opened the search bar, and typed, "Imani Vance, train incident." Nothing yet. No news. No viral clips. The world hadn't noticed. Not yet. But he remembered the girl on the train, the teenager who had filmed the truth. She had shown the officer the footage. She had saved him. And in doing so, she had witnessed something she'd never forget. Marlon swallowed the lump in his throat. He wasn't angry. Not the way people expected a man to be after what he'd survived. He was something quieter, sharper, resolved. He closed the phone, pocketed it, and whispered her name again into the darkness. Not in hate, but as a promise. You don't get to walk away from this like nothing happened. And with that, he stepped back inside, ready to begin again. Marlon woke before sunrise, not from a nightmare or restlessness, but from the stillness that follows when something within a person has shifted. The house was silent. Aubrey was still asleep down the hall, and the street outside was still cloaked in gray dawn. He moved to the kitchen barefoot, each step careful, to not disturb the fragile sense of calm that had returned. But even as he boiled water for coffee, he could feel it. It's something lingering in his ribs, like a knot pulled tight but ready to unravel. He had told himself last night that he wanted to move on, that survival was enough. But it wasn't. Not because he wanted revenge, because someone out there still believed a lie about him. And if it had happened to him, it was happening to others. Marlon sat at the table, opened his laptop, and typed slowly. Imani Vance, train incident, Midtown Line, July 12th. Still nothing. No articles, no viral posts. But it wasn't about going viral. It was about setting the record straight before someone else rewrote it again. He opened a blank document. He started writing, not to the press, not even to the police, but to someone who would understand what it meant to speak carefully in a world that heard you through a filter of fear. To whom it may concern, my name is Marlon Quaid. On July 12th, I gave my seat to a pregnant woman on the Midtown train. That act of kindness led to my public detainment, silent judgment, and a brush with being wrongly criminalized. He kept going, the facts, the timeline, the names, the doubt, but woven into every paragraph was something more potent than testimony. Restraint. Not a single curse, not a single exaggeration, just the straightforward, composed storytelling that said, I don't need your pity, I need you to listen. When he finished, he saved it, then opened a new tab. Searched. Civil rights attorneys, Jackson, M.S. The name appeared like it had been waiting. Alaric Lorne. Reputation. Principled. Fierce. There is no time for drama, but a deep belief in due process, especially for those the system usually processes too quickly. Marlon hovered over the contact form. He didn't click it yet. Instead, he looked out the window, past the chain-link fence, past the waking street. He wasn't just protecting himself now. He was preparing to protect the next man, the next boy, the next black soul, and he asked to stay quiet when accused of simply being. The kettle whistled. He poured the water with a steady hand, and for the first time since the train, his breath didn't shake. The law office of Alaric Lorne didn't look like a place for headlines. It sat quietly in a restored brick building 2 blocks off the main avenue, nestled between an old pharmacy and a shuttered barbershop. Unless you had something tangible to say, the kind of office you walked past. Marlon rang the buzzer. The door clicked. Inside, the space was clean. Old. Functional. Nothing fancy. No fake wood or framed degrees hanging in vain. Just a desk, a clock that ticked too loudly, and a man in a dark vest who didn't look up when Marlon walked in. "You're Quaid?" the man asked. Marlon nodded. "Marlon." Alaric Lorne finally looked up. His eyes were sharp, gray, not cold, but soft. He sized Marlon up without a trace of apology. "Sit. You've got 10 minutes to convince me you're not wasting my time." Marlon sat. He didn't flinch at the tone, didn't stutter when he spoke, just laid it out. The seat on the train, the accusation, the silence. The room is full of people who didn't see him, just a profile. And then the footage, the teenager with the phone, the release without charges. But no apology, no retraction, no protection. Alaric listened. No notes, no reaction. Only when Marlon paused did he lean back and speak. "You came here for what, Mr. Quaid?" "Clarity," Marlon said. "Not revenge, not noise. I want the truth on record." Alaric tilted his head. "That's rare." "What is?" "A black man who gets pulled off a train and still talks about dignity instead of damage." Marlon's jaw tensed. "You think I'm too calm for this?" "No," Alaric said, folding his hands. "I think you're dangerous." Marlon narrowed his eyes. "Men like you," Alaric continued. "The ones who don't shout, don't throw punches, don't post rants online, but still walk into a lawyer's office with their spine straight. You terrify the system because they can't dismiss you as angry, or unstable, or violent. You're clear, and clarity is hard to silence." A long silence. Then Alaric stood. "I'll take the case. Not because I need it, but the public needs to see men like you stand up and not get knocked down." Marlon stood too. "No press yet," he said. "No noise," Alaric agreed. They shook hands. Firm. No smiles. Just an understanding. As Marlon left the office, he didn't feel victorious. He felt momentum. And sometimes, that's the start of everything. Alaric Lorne didn't sleep much. Not because of stress. He'd stopped letting that run his nights years ago. But because truth had a habit of whispering between 1 and 4 a.m., and he'd learned long ago not to ignore it. Tonight was no different. The office was dark except for the glow of his monitor. His sleeves were rolled, tie draped on the back of the chair, and a cup of coffee gone cold an hour ago sat beside his keyboard. On the screen, Imani Vance. He'd pulled what little there was. No public statements, no social media, no prior lawsuits, just a few job records, a suspended nursing license in Baton Rouge, and an eviction case that had been sealed but flagged with a red asterisk. That asterisk bothered him. Alaric clicked deeper. Requisitioned a background search from a private database he trusted more than the cops. A few keystrokes later, something popped up that made him sit back in his chair. A previous false accusation. 2019. Atlanta. Same setup. Crowded space. Vague collapse. No charges were filed, but the man accused had already lost his job. He'd never filed a counterclaim. He was too scared, too tired, or too poor. Alaric exhaled, whispered under his breath, "So you've done this before." But it wasn't just the pattern, how cleanly she had moved on. No noise, no accountability, just like what would have happened to Marlon had that teenage girl not hit record. He pulled up her sealed eviction file again. Filed by landlord Clyde H. Vance, her father, dead 3 months later. No obituary, no estate settlement, just silence. Alaric drummed his fingers on the desk. "She doesn't collapse because she's unstable," he muttered. "She collapses because it's calculated." He opened a new folder, labeled it Vance, Pattern Evidence. Then he dialed a number, burner phone. A private investigator he trusted. "Need a favor," he said. Quiet background on a woman. Imani Vance, Baton Rouge, Atlanta, and now Jackson, and find out who covered up that eviction. "You think it's a setup?" "I think it's practiced," Alaric replied. He hung up, stood, and stared out his window. Downtown slept below him, but the case had just woken up, because now he wasn't just defending Marlon Quaid. He was about to prove that the system doesn't just get it wrong. Sometimes it gets played. And this time, he'd be the one playing back. It started with 37 views. A blurry video posted by a teenager with braids and a username like @TruthUnfiltered. No hashtags, no captions, just raw footage from a train car where a man gave up his seat and was almost arrested. By the next morning, it had 18,000. By noon, it hit 500,000. And by sunset, the world had a new name to argue over: Marlon Quaid. The clip was short but potent, just enough to catch the moment Marlon stood, offered his seat, and stepped back. The pregnant woman, Imani Vance, sat, thanking him. Then, later, she collapsed. Her voice, "It was him." But the camera never caught contact. It never showed a threat. It showed just fear, and how fast it turned the room. The comments were vicious on both sides. "This is why we need body cams in public spaces. Look how calm he is. This man could have gone to prison for breathing wrong. Y'all always ready to cancel a black man, huh? Maybe she was scared. Maybe he did something off camera. This is Emmett Till in an air-conditioned train." Alaric Lorne saw it from his office that morning. He didn't smile, didn't frown, just quietly said, "Right on time." He had seen it before. The court of public opinion is rising like a tidal wave, uncontrollable, hungry, dangerous. He called Marlon. "You're trending," he said. "I didn't ask to be," Marlon replied. "I know, but now we use it." Meanwhile, news outlets scrambled to catch up. They ran with the duplicate headlines, but with new tones. Viral video shows black man wrongly accused on train. Train incident sparks. Debate on racial bias. Public panic. Pregnant woman's accusation faces scrutiny after footage emerges. Most of them didn't mention Imani Vance's name, but the comments knew. The internet always finds its villain, and Imani watched it all unfold from behind drawn curtains somewhere in Jackson. Phone turned off. Her image is now the blurred face in 1,000 angry shares. Back on the street, someone stopped Marlon near the corner store. "Are you the guy from the video?" Marlon nodded, unsure what would follow. The man extended a hand, rough, honest. "Hell of a thing you kept calm through that. Respect." Marlon took it, shook once. But deep down, he knew. This wasn't the storm's end. It was just the sound of thunder catching up to the flash. Next time, it won't be on camera. It will be in court. The interview was supposed to fix everything. A soft set, warm lighting, an anchor with gentle eyes, and a voice rehearsed in empathy. This is the kind of setting meant to control the narrative, to reframe Imani Vance not as a villain, but as a vulnerable woman caught in the whirlwind of misunderstanding. She sat straight, hands folded on her lap, belly barely showing beneath a structured coat. Her makeup was flawless, but the tightness around her mouth betrayed the storm behind her eyes. The camera rolled. "Imani," the anchor began, "the internet has taken a strong interest in what happened on that train. Some say it's racial bias. Some say it's miscommunication. What do you say?" Imani exhaled slowly. "I say, trauma doesn't always look logical, and fear doesn't always wait for facts." The anchor leaned in. "You've been accused of making a false allegation, of nearly ruining a man's life. Do you deny that?" "I don't deny how people feel," Imani replied, her voice steady, trained. "But I was lightheaded. I saw shadows. I don't remember what I said word for word, but I know I felt unsafe. That feeling wasn't invented. And that man, maybe he didn't mean harm, but he stood over me, big, silent. And for a woman alone in that moment, that was enough." She paused, eyes glistening. "That's not a lie. That's a survival instinct." The clip aired at 6. By 6:05, Marlon saw it on his feed, and by 6:10, so did Alaric Lorne. "She's not apologizing," Marlon said flatly. "She's not stupid," Alaric replied. "That's how liars survive. They don't double down on fiction. They wrap it in just enough truth." But the internet was not so forgiving. Comments exploded beneath the video. "So now feeling unsafe is grounds to ruin someone? This isn't accountability. This is a PR strategy. She just described a black man existing. That's it." Some defended her, of course. "She's pregnant. She panicked. Leave her alone." Maybe both of them are victims. But the cracks had spread. A local reporter went live from Imani's old apartment in Baton Rouge, interviewing a former neighbor who remembered the last time she fainted in public in 2019. And on a podcast that night, Alaric made his first quiet appearance. "We're not trying to destroy Ms. Vance," he said carefully, "but we demand that truth be treated with the same urgency that fear receives." Back in her apartment, Imani turned off her phone. Her hands shook. She had survived the camera, but the courtroom was coming, and it didn't run on sympathy. It ran on evidence. It wasn't a press conference. There were no velvet ropes, no line of microphones, no sea of reporters flashing bulbs like sharks. It was a folding table in the back of a community center, the room no bigger than a basketball court, with rows of metal chairs and a crowd that smelled like sweat, coffee, and hard-earned curiosity. But the cameras were there, local news, a few bloggers, and live streams, most important of all. Because today, Marlon Quaid was ready to speak. Alaric stood beside him, neither towering nor commanding, just present. His stance said, "He speaks now, and you will listen." Marlon stepped to the mic. No notes, no script, just memory. "My name is Marlon Quaid," he began, calm but unshakably clear. "I'm not here to accuse. I'm not here to threaten. I'm here to correct." He paused, eyes sweeping across the room. "On July 12th, I gave up my seat to a pregnant woman on the Midtown train. I did it because it was the right thing to do. Moments later, she collapsed. And when people asked what happened, she pointed to me." His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. In that moment, no one asked me anything. They looked at me, my skin, billed in silence, and decided. I became the story, the threat, the headline that hadn't been written yet. Behind him, a screen flickered on. The video played again. The moment he stood. The moment she sat. The space between them. The moment she accused. Marlon kept talking over it. "Let me be clear. I'm not perfect. But I'm not a danger. I am not what fear made me out to be that day. And I am not the only one this happens to." He stepped away from the mic. Alaric took his place. "We've filed a formal claim," the attorney said, "not to sue for damages, but to request an official review of how these incidents are handled, and how fast an accusation becomes a verdict when it involves a black man." The room murmured. Some clapped. The live stream gained traction online. Tens of thousands watched. Some were moved, others enraged, but no one could look away. Back home, Imani watched alone, her face lit by the cold glow of her laptop screen. She closed the lid, not in anger, but in fear, because for the first time, the silence wasn't on his side. It was on hers. And the silence was beginning to sound a lot like guilt. Sometimes, the most significant lesson doesn't come from the loudest moment, but from the quiet strength of someone who refuses to let fear define them. This story reminds us that dignity is not a performance. It is a state of being. It's the choice to stay true when others misjudge you. It's standing firm when the world wants you silent. And it's knowing that justice begins with the courage to speak, even when your voice shakes. If this story touched you, made you pause, or reminded you of someone you care about, please take a moment to like this video, share it with a friend, and subscribe our channel for more powerful stories rooted in truth, empathy, and hope. Stories like this are more than content. They're bridges to understanding, to change, and to each other. Thank you for watching. Take care of yourself, take care of others, and above all, stay human.